Hi, I'm Deacon Vern with All Saints Episcopal Church, for those of you who don't know me. I've long been a Civil War buff. Back in 8th grade at the Massachusetts middle school that I went to, I was in something called the Civil War Club, where we studied Civil War history. I can remember just enjoying all the stories of Civil War memorabilia and facts and all the stories about the battles and personalities. At the end of the little session, I was actually given a book called Chancellorsville, Lee's Greatest Battle. I still have it somewhere in my collection of books back home. You know, I have long loved all the stories of the Civil War, and when I moved south, and I've lived south most of my life, in the South most of my life, I've really enjoyed the fact that so much Civil War memorabilia and historical places are just so close by. I've been, of course, to Antietam, I've been to Appomattox, Bentonville Battlefield here in North Carolina, Gettysburg, of course. In fact, I was so into preserving Civil War battlefields and monuments, for that matter. If you've ever been to a Civil War battlefield, you'll know that they're filled with monuments to both sides of the war. I was a member of something called the Civil War Trust, which actually you donated money to buy land to preserve Civil War battlefields and the monuments that were erected on them from encroachment by shopping centers and the like. About 2 years ago, though, I took a course, actually a seminar. It was sponsored by Cabarrus Equity, Racial Equity. Chuck Collier has been very involved in getting our church involved in this. And it really changed my way of looking at the world and looking at these monuments in particular. I realized how hurtful these monuments are to people who are of a different race than me. I saw them as a symbol of history and heritage, of just something recording events that happened in the past. But I learned that most of these monuments, particularly here in the South, were in fact constructed during the period of Jim Crow. And they were really not memorials to the folks who gave their lives as much as they were putting up an idea on a pedestal, and that idea being that the South, if it lost the war, it was just a fluke, and the ideals of the South were something to be preserved. And unfortunately, in some ways, whitewashing the true history of the Civil War. There is a monument in Salisbury. It's known as Fame. Most recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was actually an incident where there were a bunch of protesters in front of the monument, and a white nationalist shot over their heads. Fame on the back of it says something along these lines, that the men who died for the Confederacy, they died to preserve constitutional liberty. Well, that's a particular interpretation of the Constitution. They certainly didn't die to preserve the liberty of those who were enslaved in the South. I've looked at these statutes in a whole different light since I took that seminar, and I understand now how hurtful they can be to others who are looking at them. And in our social public squares, where we come together, often in front of courthouses and public buildings, places where we have discourse together, these statutes, again, lift up that idea of racial superiority on a pedestal. And that's not what this country was really about, was really founded on. Our country was founded on the concept that all men are created equal. About 3 or 4 years ago, you may remember that there was a riot in Charlottesville, Virginia, when the city councilman decided to take down a statue of General Lee. And a large contingent of white nationalists descended on the community to protest. It was a very violent confrontation. Actually, one white nationalist drove his car into a crowd of protesters, and it resulted in one of the protesters being killed. A very unfortunate incident. One of the protesters who was killed was those who were supporting the idea that the Confederate statue need to come down. One of the chants that was really said over and over again by the white nationalists were that the protesters should just go back to Africa. You know, this rang a certain bell for me in my head about the history of the town in Massachusetts that I grew up in. It was Massachusetts, so in the pre-Civil War days, it was very much an abolitionist community. If you stand in the south of the town I grew up in and stand on the beach and you look out across the water, you'll see a very large island. It's called Cutty Hunk, and on that island in the late 1700s, a man was born. His name was Paul Cuffey. He was a black man of Native American and African descent. And he began, strangely enough, at the time, a shipbuilding business and actually ended up owning some ships that transported cargo. He built the Quaker Meeting House that I attended as a young man in Westport, built that in 1817. Paul believed that there would not be a real, true opportunity for black people and white people to live together in this country peaceably together. He believed that it was important for African Americans who were freed to go back to Africa. So he began to transport African Americans who had freed back to the coast of West Africa to a country called Sierra Leone, which was a British province at the time. The idea was taken up by others who were abolitionists in the North. They started something called the American Colonization Society. These pamphlets have been in my family for a number of years. This first one is dated December 1st, 1841. It's called the African Repository. The last one I have is dated February 1868, 3 years after the Civil War, and they espouse the idea that African Americans should not be living in this country, even when freed, but should be returned to Africa. That is not God's dream. God's dream is that all of us live together as a family. Jesus' prayer for us, his great priestly prayer, is that we all be one, even as the Father and the Son are one. And in Genesis, God gave man dominion over all the creatures and all the things in this world, but God did not give man dominion over other men. We are to be a family. We are to love one another and to care for one another. And if a statue hurts one of my brothers and sisters, if a statue sets up a protest that creates division, if a statue symbolizes and uplifts a concept that we are not brothers and sisters, but we are separate and should be separate, then it is not something that should stand in the public forum. Go back to Africa. It's the chant that the white nationalists chanted in Charlottesville. It is the idea that was expounded in some ways by abolitionists for freed African Americans back in the days leading to and after the Civil War. But it's not God's dream. But maybe in a larger sense, in our hearts, we should all go back to Africa. Science tells us that's where we all came from, where the human race evolved, in Africa. Africa may well be the home of Adam and Eve, our mother and our father, where we are having the knowledge, the understanding that we are just one family, created by God, and that our home comes from a place called Africa, and we are all children of the same God and members of one family.